since everybody's shorter than me, I'll just to save time. Next up, we have soon-to-be Dr. Kaylee Fernandez. Kaylee is currently completing her Ph.D. in Applied Linguistics at Teachers College, Columbia University. She graduated from the University of Florida with a BA in Spanish and minors in English and education. She also holds an MA in teaching Spanish and English as foreign languages from the University of Seville, Spain. Her research interests include instructed second language acquisition, an empirical field which investigates learning outcomes through the manipulation of learning conditions with an ultimate goal of informing classroom instruction. Please give a warm welcome to soon-to-be Dr. Kaylee Fernandez.
Should I just hold it, or? Yeah, it's better.
Drop the mic.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I don't know about soon, but eventually, hopefully, I'll be a doctor. So my presentation is about learning languages, and I hope it's a situation that you guys can relate to, and I hope I can give some helpful advice. So, to start off, I want to present a situation that you might find very relatable. So you're in a classroom, and you're taking the class for many years, a second language class. So if you've been to high school here in the States, usually you have to take an elective. I know for me it was Spanish and Latin. So you take the class for so many years, and then when you actually have the opportunity to use that language, you realize that you're barely able to communicate at all. Can any of you guys relate to this? Yeah, so it's a very unfortunate situation. And the natural conclusion is that you assume that you just might be a bad language learner and you just give up. So there's some good news. Well, first of all, I can completely relate because I've actually had the same experience of learning a language myself. As I said before, I learned Latin and, well, tried to learn it. And I was also in a Spanish class when I was in high school, and I barely learned anything at all, despite being in the class for many years. I remember having to memorize endless lists of vocabulary tenses and grammar for testing. And even if I actually managed to remember all the material for the test, which didn't always happen, I would end up forgetting most of it in the long run. If you heard from my bio, you know that eventually changed. Well, a lot of it had to do with how I actually ended up studying and learning about how you learn a language. But just to back up, I'm going to talk about the field of second language acquisition. So the field of second language acquisition, I'm not sure if any of you guys have heard of that, but it broke away from the field of education in the early 70s, and it was founded under the premise of if you want to learn a second language, to learn to teach a second language well, you must actually understand how learning works, and specifically the learning of second languages, which is different from the learning of just general education. The field started off with the motivation of making teaching more effective, and researchers in this field, including myself, are dedicated to studying the process of learning a second studying the process of learning a second language. So why is this relevant to you if you're not a researcher, right? Decades of research from this field have shown that traditional language teaching approaches are actually inconsistent with research findings on how second languages are actually learned, which may be playing a large part into why so many of us have this frustration when we're in the classroom. Which leads me to some research findings. As I'm interested in this research, I could probably talk all day about different insights the field has gained on language learning, but I don't really think you'd appreciate that, as if we have a lot of interesting speeches and wine and cheese, so I won't do that. But instead, I'm going to choose 2 points that you might find relevant and something to remember. So the first is processability determines learnability, and learnability determines teachability. That's kind of a lot of words, right? What does that mean? Research findings have found that second language grammar development does not follow an externally imposed order. In other words, even if students are able to memorize a grammatical tense for a test, because a teacher or the textbook has specified that they must learn it, unless they're actually developmentally ready to process that grammar tense, they will not be able to learn it. So this has played a large portion into your frustrations. Just because a teacher says that you must learn something at a certain stage of your language learning experience, you may not actually be able to learn it. So even though you may memorize it, it won't stay in your long-term memory. The second insight from research that I want to share with you was that language acquisition is learner-driven, meaning that the person who is learning the language is actually driving learning. This may seem very straightforward, but as many of you have probably experienced firsthand, students are often expected to learn grammar and vocabulary through mechanical drills. So things that are not communicative and very repetitive without actually using your mind very much at all. So if students use this, it's no wonder that they're not able to communicate in real life situations, because it's simply what they have not practiced. You become good at what you practice. So if you practice mechanical drills, you'll become good at mechanical drills. But if you don't practice communication, you won't be good at communication. It's straightforward, but it's something that's not actually applied in most classrooms. Meaningful practice, therefore, is desirable for developing actually functional competency in the language, which means actually using the language to speak it. Which, unless you want to learn Latin, this is actually the goal of most speakers of languages. Which actually brings me back to technology. So the thread underlying all of our speeches that unites us all is technology. So I want to discuss a little bit about how technology has helped revolutionize the way we interpret and study language. So for example, recent advancements in eye tracking and fMRI imaging has allowed us to make much deeper insights into how people learn languages. So let me start with eye tracking technology, which I thought was very relevant given the whole theme of this fundraiser. So obviously, we take in the world around us with our eyes. This is obvious, and we're all here in order to help give this gift to patients who can't afford iCare in Jamaica. Eye tracking, if you haven't heard of it, is a sensor technology that enables a device to know exactly where your eyes are focused. Eye tracking interprets natural human behavior and helps us gain deep insights into people's attention and actions. As a result, we can also draw conclusions about factors that drive behaviors, including language learning. Eye tracking has recently gained a lot of traction in the field of second language acquisition because it can reveal unprecedented insights into language learners' moment-by-moment reading behavior. For example, a recent study looked at how language learners acquire vocabulary knowledge, and they found some interesting findings. They found that encountering vocabulary words repeatedly or having multiple exposures to the same vocabulary was the strongest predictor of vocabulary learning. And also, the amount of time you spend reading matters as well. They found that reading time contributed to accurately learning word meaning. So not just learning the word, but actually being able to use it in the right situations and context. So even though if you're reading a book, you may find yourself impatient because you don't think it's the fastest way to maybe learn new vocabulary in a second language, it's actually one of the best ways if you want to retain that vocabulary. Learning word lists may be fast, but in the long run, you might not gain that much from it. Secondly, I wanted to talk about fMRI research. So research using fMRI imaging has also recently gained traction in the field of second language acquisition. 50 years ago, brain research on language was limited to investigating individuals with brain damage. However, in the last 30 years, neuroscientists have used non-invasive methods, such as fMRIs, to measure healthy brain activity. For example, researchers have been able to observe that the cognitive advantages seen in bilinguals, such as the ability to rapidly switch from one activity to another, which would make sense because bilinguals are frequently switching from one language to another, can actually be accounted for in their brain structures when you observe it. So I'm sure these doctors know the terminology better than I do, but I'll try to explain it a little bit. So using fMRI imaging, they have been able to observe increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex of bilinguals, the area of the brain that becomes active during language switching tasks. So this is interesting because we're able to, by looking at the brain, understand a little more about how you learn a language. So although this technology is actually just starting to be used in our field, it's a very exciting part of our field because hopefully soon we'll be able to gain more insights into how we learn a second language by looking at the brain. So bringing it back to you, here are some tips about learning a language that I can leave you with. Usually when people find out what I study, they always ask me, okay, so how do I learn a language? That's a really complicated task to just explain to you quickly, but here are some things that I think you'll find helpful, and it's good for you to take away if you are interested in learning a language in the future. So first, if it sounds too good to be true, what do you think? It is too good to be true, right? So when you see these books about learning languages in 30 days or how to learn French through English in a week, there's these crazy advertisements that I still see all the time. It is too good to be true. Learning a language is actually a lifelong process, and it requires a lot of patience. So unless you do it the hard way and actually really work at it, you're not going to learn it. So motivation is a huge factor. Secondly, I'm also a teacher, and I always tell my students, embrace making mistakes. Making mistakes is actually part of learning a language, so even though you may have had the experience in your own language learning experience when you were in class, that your teacher got mad at you every time you made a mistake, and you were afraid of raising your hand because you knew that if you made this mistake you'd be laughed at, that's actually counterproductive because you can't learn a language without making mistakes. There's actually no way. Making mistakes is actually a very vital part of the learning process, and it helps you be able to compare what you know with what you don't know. So embrace making mistakes and just try. That's the first step of learning a language. Lastly, be immersed in the language. So I know this is not practical all the time because we can't all just go to the country of choice that we want to learn the language and spend all the time there because we have we have lives, we don't have endless supplies of money. If you do, let me know and maybe get in touch, but send me somewhere. But anyways, if you don't have all these advantages that allow you to go to another country right now, there are still things that you can do. So if you like reading, read books in that language. If you are more of an oral learner, listen to the radio. There's great programs you can listen to and actually learn a lot through that. So as much as you can do to actually be immersed in the language and use it in a meaningful way, whether it's reading, listening, or finding a conversation partner, do that. And that's going to be great and instrumental to learning a new language. So what are you waiting for? Yeah. Oh, right, questions. Sorry. Any questions? Yes. And no, I don't speak 10 languages. Yeah.
Recommend any specific apps or programs for someone trying to learn a new language? Like, what do you find works?
Right, so a lot of people have told me, I actually don't use it too much. It's a very popular app. It's escaping my mind. Duolingo. Yeah, actually, I know some research has looked into it, and I've tried it myself briefly, and it's pretty good, just for getting that initial step of learning a language, because I know you can't just go and listen to a radio program of a language you don't know at all. I think it's not the best because it's still not going to be a lot of meaningful use, but if you can do something like that, like Duolingo, just to get a start, and then as soon as you can, even if it's children's books, start reading actual material, the language that a native speaker or even a child of that language would use as soon as you can. Okay? Yeah.
In your opinion, do you think it's counterproductive to learn multiple languages at once?
Okay, I actually get this question a lot too. I think it depends on your stage of learning that language, right? So, I mean, I grew up around Spanish my whole life, but there was a time where I could understand it way better than I could speak it. But now it's no problem. So even though I'm still improving my Spanish, I try to learn French, and I had no problem not mixing those two up because I already had high proficiency in my first, like the second language. So I think as long as you're not starting to learn both of them at the same time, it shouldn't be that confusing. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay? Thank you guys.
Give it up again for Kaylee Fernandez. Muchas gracias. Salamat kaput kap. Dankeschön. Spasiba. What else? That's it. Obrigado. Arigato gozaimasu. All right, so.